Welcome to the Health Evolution. Today I'm here with Dr Zee, who is a Melbourne GP with a special interest in sports medicine and preventative medicine. Thank you so much for joining me today, Dr Zee.
Tracy, thank you for having me on. I'm looking forward to having a good chat with you today.
Yes, as am I. So I've got quite a few topics that we're going to get through. But before we get into that, could you just share a little bit about, maybe your own health evolution and particularly what's got you interested in the preventative side of medicine?
Okay, so this is a story I've probably told a fair few times already, so I'll try and skip the boring bits. Probably going through med school for a long time now, nearly 20 years ago now, I wasn't the most attentive student, at a young age. I had other things on my mind. So in a way, it was good that I didn't have to unlearn a lot of things when I started learning about nutrition and the role it plays in disease presentation and how important it is in prevention and management. So probably like a lot of people that you have on this podcast, my journey started probably from a personal perspective. So I had a bit of issues with my weight about 10 or so years ago, that I'd easily put on weight without what I thought was a problematic diet, even despite exercise. So vanity is one of the great drivers in the history of humankind. So that was probably my initial impetus in looking into this and trying a few different things. And I was always open to experimenting a little bit. So it wasn't just a weight thing. Obviously, there's a few illnesses that run in my family, high blood pressure and some obesity. And my ethnic background, being from the subcontinent, is a little bit more predisposed to things like diabetes and heart disease of late. So that was also another factor. And lo and behold, I realized that I actually had quite a few GI issues as well. I mean, as a young guy, we actually joke about it, and farting and all that becomes part of the talk with your mates when you're a youngster at uni. But I think it's probably a bit more of a delicate matter when you're of the opposite sex. But anyway, I found that a lot of my issues around flatulence, bloating, abdominal pain, altered bowel function as well started improving as my sort of dietary composition changed as well. So I did the old obligatory, as every person on this podcast probably says, I looked into things a bit deeper myself, which is just code for, found a few things that justified my sort of cognitive dissonance, and I tried a few things, cut out some sugars, but I was still having a lot of carbohydrates, and cut out carbs and sugars, and just over probably a 3-year period, I sort of found myself gravitating towards a low carb, higher fat, well, generally by ratio higher fat, but paleo, keto template, and it sort of ebbed and flowed over the last few years. So that was about 10 years ago, and initially I lost about 28 kilos from 110 to 82. These days I fluctuate. Yeah, these days I fluctuate a little bit over 90, but really over the last 10 years I've kept in pretty good health and shape at times. I've tried a few different things in that time, but basically, I sort of figure that I've had all the different food along the way in the first 30 years. So the last 10 years have been a bit more of a concentration on not having a mismatch between my health requirements and my dietary intake. So in a snapshot, that's my personal journey. And obviously from a professional point of view, working as a GP or in sort of primary care, you start noticing, you always notice chronic health and obesity and these things, but you actually become a bit more hypersensitive and hypervigilant around it, and you start to get caught up in that whole pathway of where the webs connect and how much health and food and sort of nutrition and food can take a part in reducing morbidity and mortality. And I'm not saying everything can be prevented by diet or it's a cure for everything. It's got to be used adjacent to what we know in modern medicine as being evidence-based, as long as the evidence is robust and been repeated. So it sort of, I found more and more patients coming to me. Initially, it was quite exciting that I'd be able to talk to patients about nutritional changes and I'm naive to it. So we're getting great results. Over the years, I sort of get seeked out a little bit by patients who are keen to know about a few different nuances around it all. So I maintain that with a few other jobs I do. I work in For the last 8 years, I worked at the Melbourne Football Club, working as a head doctor there, and I do my general GP clinic stuff as well. And this year has obviously been topsy-turvy for everyone. I didn't go up to the hub for the AFL for a few different reasons, mainly family. So I've actually been complementing my GP work with working in a few different places, like I'm back in emergency department in Box Hill Hospital after 10 years, which has been quite the whirlwind and quite exciting, actually. And I'm just at the moment helping out in a St Vincent's Hospital COVID clinic, just doing some screening for patients. So kind of that's where I'm at the moment, Tracy. So I hope that sort of answers your question, and I hope I didn't go on too long about that.
No, but it's added a few more questions to my list.
It always does.
Just because COVID is so top of mind. So I'm in Melbourne, you're in Melbourne, and you know, I was just saying to some girlfriends of mine who are all in Sydney, you know, like it kind of feels like we're in a different state or different country, really, because the rest of Australia has kind of just gone back to their business, and you know, we're very much in lockdown. What's your do you have any concerns about I guess us coming out of it and what's going on while we are in it? Because you've said you've had to go back and find, you know, you're back at Box Hill and doing different things. Is that because people are scared to come to the doctor at the moment? They're not coming. What's happening?
Yeah, look, it's really interesting, Tracy. And obviously, my perspective is only one of many. My main work in the GP clinic is city-based in a private billing clinic. So the type of patients we have are often city workers, usually perhaps of higher socioeconomic standing as well. So business has probably dropped off a fair bit for us in the clinic, basically because there's no one there. And a lot of the patients are probably willing to wait a bit longer. There's phone consults available, but they're not the same. A lot of patients in the city clinic have a second GP back at where they live as well. So work's dried up. There is probably a whole sense of patients, particularly the first time round in March, April, patients weren't coming at all, partly out of fear of contracting, partly out of the unknown. And I think more so because people were just waiting to see what would happen and were waiting to sort out their other affairs, whether it was things around their financial situation, their job security, homeschooling their kids. And as you know, Tracy, like most parents, we put ourselves second to our kids, and a lot of people out there probably neglecting their own health at a stage. I think this time around, there's been a lot more presentation around mental health. Obviously, it takes its toll. The chronicity of how long this has been going is definitely a bit of a pill to swallow, and the uncertainty of what happens next. And that's sort of not only stirring up people's underlying mental illnesses that they've already had, but it's sort of cascading people towards anxiety and sort of depressive, lowered mood symptoms. And particularly as we contrast so sharply with the rest of Australia. First time round, we're all in it together. Sorry, that's a catchphrase that we hear politicians use, but everyone was in a sense in a similar predicament, whether it was WA or Tasmania or Sydney or Melbourne or wherever it was. There was a bit of consistency around what happened. And I won't go into the whole issues of how this second wave started, but there's a sense of injustice by people in Melbourne. They feel like they've been wronged. And it's not that we want people in other parts of Australia to suffer what we're suffering, to endure what we're going through, but there's a real sharp juxtaposition of what they're experiencing. My family live up in Sydney, and my sister, you know, they go out to restaurants and all these sort of things. There's still a little in the back of their mind this fear of what's going to happen next, but in Melbourne it's quite stark, and it's really difficult for a lot of people. I mean, everyone is reacting to this in a different situation. I'm still lucky I get to go out of home, I get to go to work, interact with people, albeit briefly, but other people are struggling. And then it really brings out people's underlying sort of personalities. Introverts probably far better at coping with this than extroverts, perhaps a younger generation that are used to socialising. I know if I was going through this when I was in university, I'd really struggle not seeing friends and getting up to no good. But it's a bit different now for me, like the routine of work and family and spending time with my daughter. And interestingly enough, I'm exercising more now than I've done in the past because it's I was saying to a friend of mine, it's like when you have a finite limit or you have a restriction of what you can do and where you can go, you maximize it. Whereas a month ago or 2 months ago, it would have been like, yeah, I can go for a bike ride anytime I want, as far as I want. But inevitably, a lot of times I didn't. But now I'm riding over 100 Ks a week, a lot of it commuting. I'm trying to do a gym session every week. It just keeps me grounded and I can control that. But like you say, there's a lot of loss of control. And more importantly, people have lost a sense of autonomy over their lives at the moment. People have saved for years for that nest egg, and it's vanished. The businesses people have poured their heart and soul into are disappearing, and it's really hard to offset. There's a whole opportunity cost. It's not as simple as a lockdown versus no lockdown, because even if we come out of lockdown tomorrow, or level 4 restrictions, whatever you want to call them, life is not going to go back to how it was in January, regardless of whatever limitations are removed, because there's going to be no consumer confidence, spending, people are going to think twice, lack of holidays, people are going to be saving their money, which is the opposite of what the economy needs to thrive at the moment. So it's really looking at an alternative sort of society now for the next few months or years, until we sort of can claw our way back to what we once knew as our lives, which we took for granted. So yeah, it's a real hard one to reconcile. Obviously, you want to see the numbers, case numbers dropping, but more importantly, you want to see those active cases and those mystery cases really dropping lower. If you can sort of ring fence a cluster, even if the numbers are a bit higher than you want, you can sort of control that. And New South Wales has demonstrated that really well, whether it's through different contact tracing or luck or watching Melbourne or a combination of all of those. Surprisingly, they've managed to sort of suppress multiple outbreaks across the city, which is really interesting given the fact that they don't have any restrictions at the moment per se in terms of what we've been going through. So yeah, another 2 weeks until we all expect stage 4 restrictions to be limited. I know it's very easy for us to sit back and criticize and critique or think about things, the way things can be done differently. But I guess whether you respect them or you don't respect them or agree with them or not agree with them, the people that are working day in, day out are doing their best. No one wants to be in this situation. Everyone wants to get us back to where we were and minimise the damage, both directly and indirectly, that society's going through at the moment. So that's kind of my snapshot of where things are at. Obviously I can talk about coronavirus all hour if you want, because it's something that I've followed very closely. I was sort of involved with helping the AFL set up a bit of a policy early in March with some of the changes, and even those weren't even needed. Things just swept rapidly across the workplaces at that time, and things happened really quickly. But yeah, it's interesting to see where things are at in terms of borders, both domestic and international. It's going to be very interesting to see how Australia copes with that and where we go from there.
It is interesting. I guess my just listening to you talk there, if people are sitting at home and listening to this, what would, as a GP, what would be your advice to them? I mean, obviously not to sit there, but to get help. There is help still available for people.
Yeah.
If they're feeling that they're not coping, I worry about that so much, and I think there's going to be a tsunami coming after all this passes, and I don't know what's your advice on that.
Well, I think you're right. I think often in the midst of a crisis, or whether it's a global crisis or an individual or personal crisis, people initially go into that sort of fight or flight response, action mode. It's like, identify the problem, how do we get rid of it, how do we better it, how do we get through it? It's very much running on adrenaline, really powering through, getting through. And you see this even with individual grief. So if a family member's passed away, initially a lot of people get so worked up and sort of focused on things like organising the funeral and letting people know, and state affairs and selling houses and property and all that. So because it keeps you busy, it keeps you feeling like you have a purpose and there's something that you can do in life. And it takes you away from that actual process of grieving for that person that's passed. And often months will go by, it could be a year before that grief just hits you in the middle of the face, like out of nowhere, and you think, well, this is stupid. That person passed away a year ago. Why is it now that I'm feeling hopeless and despair and thinking about them all the time? Because that's when you finally let the crisis pass. You come back down to a level of function, and that's when a lot of feelings that if they're not explored and validated early on can sort of manifest in a part of you that you don't know is there, and bang, it can just grow and grow and fester. And you can see this in trauma all the time. Typical construct of PTSD when people go through something extreme, they don't have the processes in place to deal with it and sort of move on, that it just becomes this entity that grows and grows for a long time. So coming back to your original question, yes, there is help available. We're lucky we're in the age of this technology. Going through a pandemic 100 years ago, like the Spanish flu, would have been, very, very, very difficult, and interesting looking through some of the history books. Similar themes emerge with people having different opinions, and whether it's misinformation or what do you want to call it, conspiracy, or the same issues with masks, same things with distancing and all of this. And we don't know all the answers, but we do try our best, and it is very easy to sit back in one's bedroom and sort of debunk a whole lot of ideas when people are on the ground doing things. And people don't understand that science is not an exact truth. It's always developing, and our understanding of it is growing. And it's not just with things like COVID, with nutrition, with treating heart attacks in the acute setting. All of these things are always our understanding of what's best practice is always growing. And that gets incorporated into a new scientific structure of understanding. So when people see people changing their minds, I think that's an actual real hallmark of science, to be able to change your mind. But to a lot of people, the general public, they see people in authority changing their minds. It makes them think they're incompetent. They don't know what they're talking about. They're double guessing themselves. Look, sometimes that is the case, but we do what we can. So look, there is availability of GPs, doctors, emergency departments, all of that sort of stuff. If you have the fear of being physically around someone, we've adapted really well to be able to do phone and video consults. Sometimes we can fast track imaging or investigations before the examination to find out what's going on. But, it is sobering to think that rates of cancer and all these things, heart attacks, these diagnoses are dropping. And it's not because of any intervention that's making those numbers real. It's because people aren't presenting. And what that means is those cancers and those chronic ill health issues are still out there, just delaying their diagnosis. And that can be critical in a long-term outcome. You might survive COVID right now, but what happens if you're sitting there on a brewing bowel cancer or a breast cancer or a melanoma or something along those lines, that with early detection and treatment can really take away that early mortality and significant morbidity. So I urge all people that have a therapeutic relationship with their doctor to touch base, even if you don't think you have anything to discuss. If financial issues are a problem, look, I can't speak for all GPs, but I'm sure there's ability for them to bulk bill some of these consults in the current situation. We want to hear from you. We want to hear from patients, even if you're doing okay. Along the way in my medical career, I've always learned from patients as much as my peers and my mentors and clinical experience. So I might have a patient who touches base with me and tells me that they're thriving in lockdown, and I can actually learn how and why they're doing that and sort of apply it to the next patient who's not doing so well. So we're all, learning as well on the go as well a little bit. So I urge all people, make an appointment, even if it's just a touch base. And the little thing that you think is not a big deal or is not an issue, get it checked out. I don't say this to create a whole nother strata of anxiety around people's health at the moment, because I know people are going through that in isolation, but it's really just to be well informed and conscious of where you're at with your health and all these sort of things. So that would be my advice. Just as much as we're working from home and trying to keep our jobs going the same, we should do the same with our health and really try and maximize the things that are in our power, which may feel like they're very little. I mean, it starts, Tracy, from actually being honest, and that's honest with other people, honest with yourselves. If you're struggling, if you have insecurities, tell your partner, tell your friends, tell someone. No one's going to think less of you right now. In fact, that's a brave thing to do, to come forward and say, hey, I'm drowning here, help me. Because there'll be a time and place in life when you'll be on the other side of the equation, where you'll be able to have the tenacity and the skill set to do it for other people. So, catchphrases like "we're all in this together," don't mean a lot unless there's an application there as well. So that's what I would say, because there may not be any when this is over until it should actually be translated as, before COVID and after COVID, whether you like it or not. So I think, the health aspects of this, even if the vaccine becomes available pretty soon, or even if the virus mutates and transitions out into being like a common cold, and the health impacts are over in 6 to 9 months, the economic fallout is going to be lasting for years, maybe 5, maybe more. And psychologically, I think this will take at least a generation and a half for us to get through. And that could be subtle things from handshakes to kiss hellos to cultural things, suspicion of people in large crowds, even I find when you're walking down the street, mask on, people don't speak to each other. It's eyes down, no eye contact in the supermarket, no banter. It's sterile, and it actually takes away what it is for us to be a civilization, what it takes to make us human in a way, which is that warmth of interaction, which probably is where the virus hits hardest, really. So, yeah, it is very difficult. So I think reach out to family, to loved ones, to medical professionals, but try and have a balance as well at the same time, which is easier said than done. Like, this is always going to be, this is not a sprint. Whatever sort of sphere you're involved in it, whether it's from your own work, from your kids' schooling, it's not a sprint. It's a marathon. There's going to be a lot of twists and turns along the way. You can't power through it. You have to attack it in bursts, pause, recharge, and go again.
There's so much that I love about what you have just said there. Just a story to share on that. I noticed that too, out for my walks or walking up to the shop. I try and walk up to the shop now because just to get out of the house and get some fresh air. And, you do try and make eye contact with people, and just, everyone's eyes down, not looking at anyone, that whole suspicion. And I went out for a walk the other day with my 18-year-old son, who is he's just such a great teacher to me. We walked up to the shops together, and every person we walked past, he said, hello, g'day, how you going? Instantly they looked up and, oh, hi, we're just quite shocked, but it was lovely. He just, his natural energy just sort of made, I don't know, brought that really nice sort of smile out in people. And I thought, of course, that's all I need to do. I just need to say hello and look at people and smile. And, we get caught up in that, oh, no one's looking at me, I'm just going to keep, going along head down. But, such little things like that, I just thought, doesn't even, just effortless for him to sort of do that. But
yeah, that's fantastic. And you're absolutely right. As sort of stubborn or as structured or rigid as we think we are as people, we're not. People adapt in both directions very quickly. And, even the way you told that story, I could see, your body language. People are hunched in the streets. There's no sort of open, there's barriers. People sit with their hands crossed. I'm sitting there like that right now. But, there's barriers. There's sort of these communication cues that people have already of, come on, don't talk to me. But as much as you can adapt to being that way, you can actually reverse that. And on that walk would have been a great example. By the end of the walk, what was normal was for you to say hello to a stranger. Whereas, and I think it's great credit to your son. And I think a lot of credit should go to the kids. There's been a lot of attention at the moment on kids, school-age kids and even younger, about the impact this will have. And obviously there will be a huge impact on kids, particularly with disruption of their schooling and not being able to get on to their peers and have that social interaction. But, it's a two-edged sword, the modern technology and social media that's allowed kids to still have communication with each other. But at the end of the day, I think kids are very, very resilient. They have to be. And throughout history of mankind, children are often seen as this fragile entity that needs to be cared for, which they are, but they're also extremely resilient and adaptable. And I can see it in my daughter as well, like the way she's been able to adapt to the parameters around childcare and parks and not restaurants and swimming lessons and ballet and whatever else it is. They just get on with it. As long as kids feel, and this would be my advice to parents without sounding preachy, but as long as kids feel safe and they feel that they have their parents there to bail them out of trouble. And I know a lot of people have a different school of thought on that, thinks you don't want to mollycoddle your kids and get them ready for the real world. But I say stuff that no amount of sort of down the line hard parenting will get anyone get prepared for a pandemic like this. So I think the kids that feel safe, feel loved, and have a safe environment in their home, and that's something a lot of children take for granted. There's a lot of, unfortunately, there's a lot of domestic issues out there in society, and obviously COVID's amplifying them. But if you can provide that safety and that nurturing environment for a child, they will adapt. They will be fine. The adults are the ones that will struggle. They're the ones that don't have their routine and their structure and have always done it a certain way. But kids are growing, they're always learning, there's always, especially in that younger age as well, there's always something new stimulating them, whether they're learning to read or write or play a musical instrument or language or whatever it is. Their brains are wired to constantly learn. So emotionally, they can adapt to learn to whatever environment we're living in, whether it's a pandemic or whether it's issues around bushfires that we saw early in the year or whatever it is. Kids will adapt. Let them show you sometimes a way of how they can adapt, and we can learn from them. Like I say, you can always learn from people in the most surprising places.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. And I think that's what I do a lot. I look at my kids and that inbuilt resilience that they have, we've got it too. I think we just forget it. And so it's just a nice reminder when, the kids show us that. And yeah, I love that. And I agree with you completely. I think for me, my priority with my children was to make sure that they knew, that they were safe, they were okay, that, we would ride it. Some days they get really annoyed that they're still at home doing homeschool. My son in year 12, he'd love to be with his mates at school and having a end of year formal and all that stuff that, the rite of passage with year 12, but he's not going to have it this year. And, it's just a good learning too, to see that they'll still be okay, that, it is what it is. And, some days you have to just ride that wave, but, being safe and feeling safe is just so important for kids. I'm with you. I'm not with the hardline parenting either. Can we stay on the topic then? Because I think, the questions are kind of,
We can talk about anything you want. I can rabbit on for ages.
Can we tie it into COVID a little bit? Because I guess I've kind of spoken a little bit about my concern that there's so much chatter out there around the outside in, masks, social distancing, waiting for the vaccine, lockdowns, which, are strategies that we're doing. And there's, obviously that's what's happening. But there's very little talk around, okay, how can we build our own immunity against it? And, A.C.E.P in the UK has been really vocal about, helping. I think he saw this great opportunity, with Boris Johnson getting it himself and having a bit of an epiphany. And he's taken on this role to, use it as a chance for people to, I guess, learn about how we can build our own immunity to protect ourselves from getting it. So could we talk a little bit around your thoughts around that? What can we do? And does nutrition play a role in that? Barring, of course, I understand everybody listening to this is going to be in a different place. For some people, this is not where their head is at, and I understand that. But there are some people who would be really genuinely curious about learning more around that. So I'd love your thoughts on that.
I mean, I've got a lot of thoughts on this. And first and foremost, there's no one size or one magic cure for everything. Everything has to be in context of everything else. And I think definitely nutrition plays a role in building up one's baseline health. Okay, that's undisputed, undoubted, and there's a lot of strategies that we can take to do that. But it means nothing if you're just focused on nutrition and you're not looking at things like sleep or exercise or other lifestyle measures and stress. I mean, if you have a triangle of three vertices, nutrition, sleep, and stress management in terms of three of the foundations of helping help improve your health and your well-being. Ideally, if you have three all going well, you need two, I reckon, to sort of maintain where you are. And one probably is not going to make any positive change. So if you're eating your nutrition plan is optimized for your sort of genetic phenotype, but you're not sleeping well and you're constantly stressing, you're probably not going to see any gains. Now, there's a backdrop of what I'm trying to say is that one of those points in the triangle is gone. No matter how chilled and relaxed and together you are going to be at a heightened level of stress during this pandemic, no matter who you are. You are, I am, we all are. And for some people, it'll be even higher. And it's very easy to say, well, if I'm stuffed from the stress point of view, what's the point of worrying about my sleep? Staying up and watching some movies late at night helps me feel distracted, but it also interferes with your sleep as well. And I'm not saying don't do that, and it's not a holier than thou type situation, but I think give yourself the time to grieve. And what you're grieving for at the moment really is a sense of your old life, who you were, and this sounds a bit doom and gloom, but who you were, what your aspirations were, what your goals were in life, and where you were heading. That's going to be shifted for everyone, whether it's minutely or a major actual shift in where you're heading. Relationships may end in this period, jobs may be lost, health outcomes might happen. So whoever you are, there's going to be a shift. So have the time to grieve for who you are or who your routine was, and then put a plan in place of how you can make the best out of the situation, and talk to people that you trust and experts, and know that it's not going to be easy. And, if we look at Mount Everest and we look at the peak, we think, how the hell are we going to summit that? It's just impossible. Why bother trying? But if we look at base camp, we think, all right, to get from, Kathmandu to Lukla, you take a little plane in, and it's about a 7 or 8 day easy hike to get to base camp 1. Not too hard. You'll adjust along the way. You'll get used to the altitude if you go slowly. Once you get to base camp, you can decide where you want to go next. Do you want to go to the next camp? Do you want to rest for a bit? And ever slowly by slowly, you can claw your way up to what you perceive to be your endpoint, which is always going to shift. So that's what I would say without going into the specifics just yet. It's got to be small incremental changes that are sustainable, and realize that you will go backwards. There'll be a couple of steps back, a couple will be forward, but you just got to keep your momentum. It's like when you're on a bicycle and you lose a bit of traction, you run over a stick or something and your bike's wobbling. The instinct is to slam on your brakes and take stock, but that's just going to make you fall and hurt yourself. If you just keep pedaling and pointing the handlebars forward, the bike starts forming its momentum, and you still keep going into a straight line and basically keep going where you are. Yep, you deviated when you hit the stick and you almost fell off, but you kept going. So it's important in whatever way you can, you keep clawing forward in this situation. So going back to your question, what are some of the things we can control? What are some of the things that can help us with COVID? I guess if you can broadly separate the two groups into intrinsic and extrinsic factors. So intrinsic means things pertaining to yourself, and extrinsic are away from yourself. So in your own self, how much it makes a difference, I don't know. And no one can say for sure, but if you can optimize your own health, and people won't like hearing this because often the things that we use to unwind and reward ourselves are the very things that hurt us. So, junk, sugary food, alcohol, smoking, all these sort of things, I think can detract from your body running in its optimum capacity. So if you contract COVID and your immune system has to fight, you only want your immune system to fight on one front. Without going off on a tangent and talking about history, one of the key reasons people think that Hitler was unsuccessful in World War II was because he got too greedy. He wanted to fight on the Western Front, he wanted to fight on the Eastern Front, and it was really when he went into Russia, all guns blazing, in terrible conditions, that his troops weren't able to spread it and fight two fronts. So, not that I'm advocating for Hitler or anything, but the analogy is if you want to focus your fight in one place, the best you can do is that. You don't want to be fighting metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance, and a whole host of other chronic health issues at the same time as trying to get your immune system to fight off a new and a complex virus that's just popped up. So that's where you can control your destiny a little bit. So intrinsically, that's what you can do. So you can control your sleep, you can control your, or you can try and control your sleep, you can try and control your stress. You can make a journey to try and reverse any metabolic issues. So people will think, well, it's taken years for these things like diabetes and ill health to develop. What's the point of, trying to combat them now? It might take months or years for me to make any meaningful improvements in my health. And that's absolutely true. And when you compare it to the velocity and the speed at which the virus multiplies and exponentially affects members of the community and can cause significant mortality and morbidity, it feels like a disconnect of why am I worried about slowly dropping off a bit of weight and eating a bit healthier, which is a long-term sustainable goal, versus the virus. But I think every little step counts. And even if it's the discipline to try and do something in your control to help, it'll have a flow-on effect to other aspects of your illness. Now, I'm not saying everyone, if they go on a low-carb diet, won't get COVID. That's ridiculous. By no means am I saying any of that, but I'm saying maximize your ability in a fight. You don't go into a race, a car race, without checking your tires and pressure and all of that, maximizing your vehicle. Even if the terrain of the race is horrible and there's going to be all sorts of damage, you keep your car in the best possible shape before you go in. And if you get damaged in a race, you wait till you can repair all the problems before the next race. Unfortunately, for most of the population, and you look at places like America where this is just showing its head, the chronic ill health problems, not to mention the bipartisan and the political nature of the virus and masks and other issues. But it just shows itself as one of the key factors in propagating the severity of the virus. So those are some of the intrinsic things. Extrinsically, look, you can see what the government's doing. You can, if you're not happy with something, you can lobby in a meaningful way. And a lot of debates come around masks. Look, I don't like wearing a mask. I wear a mask at work. I have to wear an N95 mask at work for prolonged periods of time. I've got marks on my nose. They're uncomfortable. You get dehydrated. And it doesn't feel natural. You look at someone, you can't tell if they're smiling. You can't tell what half the body language, half the tone is gone in conversation. And that's a real cue that doctors use with patients to pick up the underlying presentation, the story, and the way they communicate. I don't like wearing a mask outside. I don't think there's probably a lot of benefit wearing a mask outside if I'm by myself and no one's around. But it's about forming habits. And hopefully at some stage you can see them lifted. The whole issue of masks, you can debate it till cows come home. Does it protect you? Does it stop me from contracting the virus from someone else, or does it stop you from getting it from me? But they don't work anyway, and et cetera, et cetera. Look, I don't know all the research on masks, but I do know this. It's not about getting COVID or not getting COVID. One of the key reasons healthcare workers died and were affected, particularly early on, before significant PPE was implemented, particularly in places like China and Italy and New York, is the issue of viral load. So if someone is sick, if someone's working in emergency, this is at the early days of the virus and didn't realize, is it respiratory droplet spread, or is it airborne, or is it worse from certain procedures like intubation or nebulizers or all those sort of things? If you're working in emergency 8 hours and you come across 5, 6, 7, 8 COVID positive patients, and usually the ones that go to hospital are usually quite ill, quite sick. There's been a lot of viral replication, and they've probably got what they call a high viral load. So, for example, someone who's not that unwell, who passes by and coughs once, there might be a little bit of viral load there. Someone who's in emergency, who's been sick, you're not just seeing one patient, you're seeing the next, the next, and the next, and the next, all quite sick, all with higher viral loads, all you're doing highly sort of provocative procedures that invokes a lot of aerosols in the air, there's a huge transmission of viral load there. And I think it's really related to the amount of virus that hits you first, the amount that replicates, and then the immune system has to play catch up, and it takes time. So the damage could also be set there. So whether the mask stops the virus or not, I think it substantially reduces viral load. And that could be a real reason why transmission rates are lower, or you're seeing transmission but less morbidity and mortality from them, relatively speaking, if you take the aged care sector aside for a minute, which is a whole other topic in itself. Both the way it's been handled and both the reflections that how society have towards people and think, oh, they were old anyway. They were in their 70s, they had a good innings, who cares? But think about if that was your mother or your uncle or someone you knew who, it's easy to say, oh, but they're not like that. They're not, bedbound. It's very easy for us to generalize and make these assumptions. And look, it is very difficult. And I'm not saying every person that died in aged care was going to live another 10, 20, 30 years, but it's not our choice to make that. And I think human life is something that should be dignified. And when the moment we stop putting profound value on human life, no matter what age or what contribution they make to society, we sort of lose that humanity a little bit. And we're seeing that across the globe now. A lot of people with their comments, a lot of it is projections of their own insecurity and what they desperately want the world to be like, and justify some of their decision making. So, sorry, I'm ranting, but going back to your original question about what we can do, you can control as many intrinsic factors as possible, and switch off from the virus. Don't spend all your time Googling it and looking at it. And a lot of people do this when they first come to low carb and stuff, spend all the time obsessing over it and trying to be the best low carb or whatever it is. But the whole point is to become healthy, to have vitality, to actually enjoy life. Rather than read the next blog post by the next person or the next study, go out, go for a run, learn an instrument, play with your kids, write a book, write a short story, do a puzzle, whatever it is, be human. Make mistakes, whatever it is, just live, but don't just sort of be a slave to the information. And same with COVID, switch off from it, do something nice, connect with your partner. We've been shut off from physical contact from so many people, which is, for some people that's not a huge deal. For a lot of people, it feels very unnatural and unjustified that we can't touch and connect with people. So if you do have someone with you, try and create some intimacy. I mean, intimacy, affection, sex, all of that is very important at the moment. If you're not working, you don't have an excuse not to have sex with your partner tonight. You don't have to be up early for that meeting. So go for it. Let's make some COVID babies out there. You won't have time to wallow in or sort of ruminate over things when you're running after a baby. But look, I'm being facetious, but I think it's very important to have an outlet, whatever it is, and that can help you. So, changing your diet and looking after your health may not help you today or tomorrow or next month or even in 6 months, but if you manage to avoid COVID for another year, and we keep talking about mortality rates. Oh, it's only 1%, and it's the elderly, etc., etc. Who cares? There's so much we don't know about the morbidity. Look at polio. Was it 5 to 10% of people are left with complete paralysis? They're not considered in the mortality numbers. But with COVID, there's so many. It's a multi-organ virus. It doesn't just infect your respiratory tract. Any cell that has an ACE inhibitor, whether it's an ACE channel, can be affected. Whether that's your heart, your lungs, your kidneys, your blood vessel walls. You can present in all sorts of different ways. There's this so-called phenomenon of the long haulers. People that have had COVID but have taken months and months to recover. We hear a lot about people with chronic fatigue type syndromes and these sort of things, and we're just scratching the surface on what it does to people. The biggest tragedy would be being hasty and not knowing the ramifications, the long-term ramifications, and taking years off people's lives, especially young people on the latter end of their lives, especially the quality of life. It's not years; it's quality of life that's important. So those are some of my thoughts around COVID. And it is a very complicated and emotive subject at the moment because we don't have the luxury of hindsight. We don't have the luxury of stepping back and having a big picture look at it. It's like a football game. You don't have a match review in the middle of the fourth quarter when things are going pear-shaped. You just claw your way to try and survive and use instinct to try and win the game. Afterwards, you look back at it and think, what did you do well? What did you not do well? What can you learn for next time? How can you apply all the things you learned before the game to the game? Did you execute your plan, etc., etc.? It's very difficult to do that. I know there's inquiries and I know there's things going on all the time, but it's very difficult in the heat, in the middle of the storm, to be able to plan for the next storm or sort of analyze our efforts in fighting the storm without sort of the emotion and the subjectivity being taken out.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there's so much advice in there, and I was going to recap a few things, but I won't because I'm really conscious that you've got to go. But can I just quickly get your opinion on just one thing with COVID, since we're talking about it, the vaccine? Any opinion on that? That's causing a little bit of divide and concern out there. I think that we're going to have this sort of forced upon us, and very pro-vaccine myself. Also, have to be honest and say I'm a little bit concerned about something that's being rushed out and our freedoms potentially being, tied to it. But from your perspective, a medical perspective, and a very educated, smart person, I'd love your thoughts on that. I know it's very early and there's no right or wrong, and I'm just interested, that's all.
Look, I think one of the greatest advancements in human sort of medical, in the medical area that we've done over the last few hundred years have been grand scale public health measures, far greater than any sort of drug or any surgical technique or the ability to stent the heart if you think that's warranted for a heart attack, and etc. etc. It has been public health measures by far that make the biggest impact, whether that's things around sanitation or hygiene or understanding germ theory and infectious diseases. Some of the advancements we could make around perinatal morbidity and mortality, taking death rates right down for both mother and baby over the last 100 years, has been one of the real reasons the population's been able to boom and survive. And even when you account for the great loss and devastation to life that World War I, World War II, and all the other, a lot of the wars that have happened in the last 100 years, we've still managed to push the envelope with lifespan and morbidity prevention and reducing mortality. And one of the pivotal things in that is vaccines and preventable illnesses. And I know the topic of vaccines is very emotive for a lot of people because everyone's got an opinion and there's been a lot of conjecture and associations around there. But it's, to me at least, undeniable that the ability of what vaccines have been able to do for humans has been remarkable. I mean, you look at some of the diseases that have been eradicated over the years, smallpox. When Christopher Columbus and his crew set sail across to find India and found the Americas instead, yes, the political aspect of wiping out indigenous populations for land and all that existed, but one of the key components in that was introducing a virus or a disease or a pathogen to a naive host, which was basically the indigenous population of the New World. And it just ravaged and decimated populations more than any warfare and slave trade and all these things did. And similar to the Australian Indigenous population, when Europeans first colonised here a couple of hundred years ago. So you can only look at through those lenses and see the horrible nature of what these diseases do. The fact that smallpox was eradicated in the last century is probably one of the greatest feats, up there with, going on the moon. It's just not as sexy as that, is it? Seeing Neil Armstrong put the flag in. But so the role that vaccines have played, it's probably, up there with the advent of antibiotics. And that's one of the reasons mortality in the Spanish flu was so high, was the just coming off, World War One and poor infrastructure and things like that, but also the secondary bacterial infections. So you get influenza, and then you'd be getting concurrent pneumonia. And back then there wouldn't be any antibiotics to fight that. So it was devastating. We're in a far better spot now. We're in a far better position now. We have, brilliant minds all over the world working really hard from many angles to help fight this virus and end the pandemic. And I think you're absolutely right to ask the question about the vaccine. People that try and suppress people asking questions, it doesn't help. There are going to be concerns about the nature of the vaccine if it's rolled out too quickly. And for a vaccine to work, it's got to go through all the rigorous trials. And I'm very thankful we live in a country where I think at this stage, despite what Scott Morrison said a couple of weeks ago, some of that is PR and some of that is to distract away from aged care saga and questions around that. He's talking about securing something that we don't even have a product for yet. But that's okay. We'll get there. We don't know if a vaccine will be produced. I think mumps was the fastest vaccine to be produced. I think it took 5 years. Obviously, we have a lot more technology, a lot more money being thrown at this, and we're battling it from many aspects. But we've got to remember there's never been a successful vaccine against the coronavirus before. The reasons for that, there's a few reasons. Many of the coronaviruses, at least 3 of them, just cause a common cold. There's no point finding a vaccine for that because there's no cost. SARS-1 basically sort of was a bit different from SARS-2 in that it affected only the lower respiratory tract. So by the time you became quite sick, it happened quite quickly. It was a short incubation period, and you didn't transmit once you were that sick. So it sort of died out, burnt itself out. So what I'm trying to say in a long-winded way is the great white hope of the vaccine is there. We should definitely work towards it. But for a vaccine to work, it's basically got to show efficacy. So not only does it need to produce antibodies to the pathogen, they've got to be neutralizing antibodies. There's no point producing an antibody that binds to the virus but doesn't neutralize its activity, doesn't neutralize its potency in the way it gets into the cell and causes damage. That's basically just tagging the virus and not doing anything about it. So we've got to see in large trials if it's got the efficacy and it can neutralizing antibodies are key. The next thing is you've got to make sure that there's no side effects. And most vaccines have side effects. They're usually fleeting, and for a small proportion, they can be quite significant. You look at the yellow fever vaccine. It's not recommended for people that are immunocompromised or elderly because it can trigger a yellow fever type reaction. For those that don't know, yellow fevers are transmitted by mosquitoes. It's a 50% mortality rate for those that contract it, but the vaccine is very good at stamping that out. So it's got to do its job. And some of the issues around SARS-1 vaccine trials were that the immune response that the vaccine produces actually triggered more of a cytokine immune storm and caused ARDS. I'm sure the authorities know this. There's people that are infinitely smarter than me and more well-read and dedicated their whole lives to vaccines. I'm just an observer that's trying to piece together some information for myself. I'm sure people are working very hard from all angles, and when the vaccine, if it is ready, once it's gone through phase 3 of 1, 2, and 3 of trials, the next issue is that it's got to be mass produced and mass distributed at the same time. And that's for the whole world. That is an undertaking that is going to be enormous. And you can see what's going to happen. There's going to be political divisions left, right, and centre, and there's going to be financial sort of stresses and financial sort of motivators out there for companies and governments, despite their best assurances now. Then the next thing is it's got to be taken up there's got to be enough uptake by people. You don't want the you don't want the rhetoric around masks to morph into rhetoric around vaccines. And I think people have to understand that this is not like a natural disaster, like Boxing Day tsunami of 2004, where the impact was fierce and it was in your face and it was all at once. But then after that moment, it was all about the recovery effort. And if you weren't there, it didn't affect you. But this is different. It's taken away our ability to connect with people by making us, it's connected us all together in a sort of ironic sense, in a negative way. So without answering your question, I think there's work to do. People are really working hard around the clock. I think the concept of vaccines is one of the greatest discoveries that we've been able to put through. And there's all sorts of different vaccines. There's monoclonal, there's B cells, T cells, all these sort of things that aren't sort of beyond the scope of this talk or this podcast. But I think the key is making sure it's safe, making sure it works in terms of neutralizing antibodies. And really the question is how long it'll last for. Is this a vaccine you only need once? Is this a vaccine you'll need to take every year or every 6 months? That's going to affect the uptake as well, and the buy-in. And the efficacy in terms of herd immunity, which is what you get through vaccines. And look, we're lucky that coronaviruses don't tend to mutate, historically at least, a lot, but they find a way. Life wants to live. Life wants to live. Life goes on. Underneath it, whether we're a virus or whether we're a multi-cell organism as ourselves, at the real core of our DNA is cellular propagation, replication, and continuation. That's at the heart of our being. So we make it more abstract as humans with, art and knowledge and legacy in our children, or legacy that we leave in our work. But at the core of it all, it's just propagation of our genetic material. So a virus will fight just as hard as we do to propagate its genetic material. So the virus may transform in a way that allows it to infect hosts and replicate. But the key is it doesn't want to be so powerful that it actually kills the host. And this coronavirus has really sat in that sort of Goldilocks sweet spot, the Goldilocks zone that they use for, the planet being distant from the sun to allow life. But this virus is really actually, in a way, continuing on because it's in that Goldilocks zone. So I do hope one day we get a vaccine, and I do hope that it is safe, neutralizing with minimal side effects, that's able to be mass produced and mass distributed, and there's significant uptake from the global population. And the question of whether it's mandatory or not mandatory becomes irrelevant, because it's something that will take us to a path of getting a sense of normality of our lives back. But that's basically all I can say about vaccines.
Well, that was very well said. Thank you so much. I'm going to have to let you go. It's hard to believe I actually wanted to have this whole conversation with you around the carnivore diet. So maybe one day we can try and organise another chat and talk more about that. But
look, I'm more than happy to come back and talk about carnivore diet, nutrition, exercise, whatever you want to talk about from both a professional and a personal perspective. But I think in the current climate, it's naive not to sort of allow the dialogue around COVID-19 and what it means to enter into the conversation, into the podcast, because it's just pervasive. It's there, whether you like it or not, or no one likes it. But it's there. It's pervasive. It's ongoing. There's twists and turns. What we know about it now will be different to what we know about it in 6 months. Some lives will be irrevocably, will be changed forever in more ways than one. And I feel for everyone. I feel for those affected directly by the virus. I feel for the ones that have lost loved ones. I feel for the ones that feel like they're in lockdown. People in rural Victoria, where there's no active cases, have the same rules as other parts of Victoria. And I can understand how unjust it feels for people to lose their livelihoods, their business, their dreams, things that they've toiled away for years to put every sense of themselves into, and sort of a sense of pride, a sense of legacy for them, be so quickly dismantled and destroyed, and make people feel clueless and lost. So I do feel for those people. I feel for people in Melbourne. I felt for the people that went through this first in early July when the towers were locked down. That was heart-wrenching to see people in that situation. But, I know it's been very doom and gloom and this conversation, but look, I don't think all hope is lost. I think I should try and leave it on a positive note, which is that,
that'd be nice.
we find a way over the
we do.
span of our evolution.
Yeah.
We have done amazing things and shown amazing empathy and understanding and warmth towards one of each other, and taken ourselves to places we never thought possible. And, it's only at that low point, where you can actually really relish the opportunity to take someone or take yourself back to that high point. Inspiration is a powerful thing and it's contagious. So if you can make one positive change for one person, inspire one person, if the amount of crap that's been coming out of my mouth the last hour resonates with just one person on your podcast, that'll make me a happy man. Because maybe the flow-on effect, if you talk about R0, maybe that R0 will flow on to the next person and the next person. I'm not naive to say that positive language and positive thought can defeat, something that's, primal and been around since the dawn of life on this planet, that the viruses and pathogens, but it can help our reactions to them and our ability to sort of hold steady and keep going.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
No, it was a pleasure for me. Thank you so much. All the best.